Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and so Z490 has been announced, and one of the features that's been announced is perk or hyperthreading on-off functionality. So you can disable hyperthreading on a specific core, and I think this is really cool, and a lot of people probably have no idea why, and so we're gonna do this very theory-crafty video about why I think perk or hyperthreading is extremely cool. So basically what it allows you to do is to take your 10 core 20 thread CPU and potentially convert it into a 10 core 19 thread CPU. Which this might actually be viable for, like, this might actually make sense to run daily, which we'll get to why. It'll also allow you to potentially convert your 10 core 20 thread CPU into a 10 core 16 thread CPU, let's say because you're benching 3D Mark Vantage, and 3D Mark Vantage does not scale above 16 threads. And there's other benchmarks out there that don't scale above a certain number of threads, and yeah, so for those benchmarks, this is really, really cool. Also, I want to do, because like this, so basically we're going to do a quick theoretical comparison of 1016 versus 816. Which goes heavily in favor of the 10, it goes quite heavily in favor of the 1016. And then also what's cool is, like, if you have your 8 core 16 thread CPU, you could potentially run it as an 8 core 15 thread CPU for the same reasons that you would do a 10 core 19 thread CPU. And we're going to get to that. So the thing with hyperthreading is hyperthreading does not double the power of your CPU. In general, on Intel, it adds, like, in workloads that scale with hyperthreading, you're going to see roughly 33% more performance. Yeah, and that's like Cinebench. And there are also workloads where hyperthreading actively harms performance, where if you enable hyperthreading, the workload gets slower. Where if you run the, like, there are, like, let's say you have a 9900K, and you can run the workload as 8 threads, or you can run it as 16 threads. Well, in 16 threads, it'll actually do work slower than in 8 threads. So there are certain workloads like that where hyperthreading is actually bad. But they're kind of exceptions, so that's why most CPUs come with hyperthreading or simultaneous multi-threading these days, because the workloads that don't scale with them are kind of rare. And if you have one of those workloads and you're serious about running it, well, you can just disable the hyperthreading or the simultaneous multi-threading. But anyway, so the thing is, generally hyperthreading is going to be about 33%, and I think SMT for AMD is slightly more efficient, where it's a bit more than that, but yeah, hyperthreading about 33%. So we can do some cool calculations with this. So first up, let's compare our 10-core 16-thread CPU versus our 8-core 16-thread CPU. And the cool thing with this is so, how do we do this comparison? So essentially, if we have our 8-core CPU, we can, with hyperthreading enabled, we can just take our 8 cores, multiply it by 1.33, and we get a sort of equivalent core count in real cores. So equivalent real core count, you could sort of call it. So let's just quickly do that calculation, which is 8 times 1.33, and we get 10.64. So an 8 core with hyperthreading is like a 10.64 core CPU. That's essentially what this equation is saying. For some workloads. There are obviously workloads that don't scale, in which case you would actually, your 8 core with hyperthreading is still an 8 core, and then there's this workloads that scale negatively, where your 8 core with hyperthreading is like a 7 core. So, but we're not here to deal with the edge cases like that, or, well, the exceptions like that. Now let's do the 10 core with 16 threads. So what's cool about that is you're gonna have 6 times 1.3. Wait, am I doing that right? Because yeah, you disable hyperthreading on 4 cores. So you have 6 cores with hyperthreading, and then you have 4 cores without the hyperthreading. So we just add that to the first 6 hyperthreaded cores, and we get our lovely ratio again. And so 6 times 1.33 plus 4 is 11.98. And so in workloads that scale perfectly with hyperthreading, and like there are potential weird things that could happen with the software that would throw this off, but 11.98 divided by 10.64, you get a 12.6% advantage in favor of this. So a 10900K running in 10 thread, 16 thread, 10 core, 16 thread mode should have a 12.6% performance advantage for something like 3D Mark for 3D Mark Vantage's CPU test, in theory. Okay, very much theoretical. And I'm not sure how how good Vantage is at like dealing with some weird, core thread setup like this. But if Vantage doesn't, like, if the software itself doesn't have a problem with it, it should behave like this, and you just pick up like 12.6% at the same frequency. So if both CPUs are at 5 gigahertz, this one will be 12% faster, which I think is really cool. Moving on, let's talk about the 10 core 20 thread versus the 10 core 19 thread setup. So that is, 10 times 1.33 versus 9 times 1.33, and that obviously is just 13.3 plus 1, and then we have 9 times 1.33 plus 1, and that I'm not doing in my head. So let's ask the calculator again. So that works out to 12.97. And you might be like, so the equivalent core count ratio here is lower. And it's like, yes, but the thing is, the gap between these two numbers is very small. 13.3 is only, give me a second while I calculate this, it's only, so, well, actually, I did it off screen, so at this point it doesn't matter, but this gap here is about, so going upwards, that's 2.5%. And why is this significant? Well, let's say you have your 10 core CPU, right? And we're not going to draw this, but one of those 10 cores is terrible, and it only does 5 gigahertz. And all of the other cores can do 5.1 gigahertz, right? If you go, actually, no. If one core was terrible, it would be like 4.9 gigahertz versus the other cores doing like 5.1, right? Well, if you disable hyperthreading, you could easily pick up 100 or even 200 megahertz because it takes a lot of load off of the crappy core. So you disable the hyperthreading on the crappy core, and essentially you can do something like, you can do like 5.1 times 12.97 vs 5 times 13.3. Now, this actually works out in terms of multi-threaded performance in favor of this. In single-threaded, this is ever so slightly faster, and the difference between these two is not that big. So, like, this right here is 66.5, whereas the other one is 5.1 times 12.97. Whereas this is 66.147. So the multi-threaded performance gap between these two, very, very small. And it gets, what's really neat is if you could run, say, 5.15 gigahertz at with your 19 thread CPU, and you can do this because BCLK overclocking works just fine on Z. Like, Intel has gone out of their way to make BCLK overclocking work ever since like Z170. They do disable it on the non-K CPUs, but if you have a K SKU, you can run like pretty much whatever BCLK you want will work. Up to there are limits to it, but you can go up to like 120 BCLK without any issues, and I think the Z270 BCLK world record is like 450 megahertz of BCLK. So there's a lot of BCLK range on the on basically modern Intel K CPUs. Non-K CPUs, as soon as you go past 103, the Intel management engine won't allow you to post. So you can't actually boot at that point. But anyway, so 5.15 times 12.97 works out to be 66.7955. So basically, this right here at 5.15 gigahertz, a 19 thread 10 core CPU with 19 threads has more multi-threaded performance than a 10 core 20 thread CPU at 5 gigahertz. So if you can pick up 150 megahertz by disabling hyperthreading on your 10 core CPU, it makes perfect sense to just disable the hyperthreading. If you can pick up 200 megahertz, it makes even more sense to do so, right? Like, I think this is really cool because it's like, yeah, you can kill the hyperthreading to get a little bit more like multi-threaded and single core performance at the same time. So that's really cool. For the 8 core, it doesn't work out quite so well because obviously you have less threads in total. Like this would be really like if they had this for like X299, that would be so sick. Like, could you imagine an 18 core with like 32 threads for Firestrike instead of a 16 core with 32 threads? Like, man, I can't wait for when Intel like they're gonna introduce it on their high-end desktop platform eventually. I can't wait for the day when they do that. That'll be super super sick. Um, so because yeah, you'll be able to run just like the weirdest potential like threat, especially if they go up to like a 20 core or 22 core. All like yeah, that like partial hyperthreading is cool. Like it is really really cool from a benchmarking perspective. But also, if you do have a really high core count CPU and you have like, 3 cores on that CPU that are trash, you disable hyperthreading on the 3 trash cores. If you pick up 100 or 200 megahertz, your overall score will still go up. Right? Like that's the crazy part. It's just like we don't need the hyperthreading anymore. Um, because you can offset the loss in hyperthreaded cores with just raw frequency, and frequency is better because it's predictable and doesn't require well optimized software, and that's kind of why like Intel is all like that's why Intel still has advantages over the massive like there are still workloads where Intel beats AMD. Is just like there are workloads where having more cores doesn't really do anything. You also need raw frequency. Um, so yeah, so I think this is really cool. And some people might be like, Buildzoid, you're turning into an Intel shell. I'm sorry that I find an overclocking feature cool, but um, yeah. Anyway, so for the 8 core, the comparison's basically the same, right? You do 8 times 1.33, which we already have the number for that. Yeah, that's 10.64. So we're just gonna go grab our 10.64, right? And we need to compare that against 7 times 1.33. And this is not going to be worth it for a 6 core at all. Like an 8 core, it can maybe work. 10 core, definitely, this might be a viable option. But on a 6 core, you just don't have enough threads for this to be a good idea. But anyway, so what does that equal? I don't know. Let's ask the calculator. 1.33 plus 1. Yeah, so that actually, that works out to be 10.31. So the ratio between those two is if we take 10.64 and divided by 10.31, that works out to about 3.2%. So basically, this gap right here between these two, like if you wanted to go up to that, you'd have to gain 3.2% more frequency, which that's actually kind of difficult. That's like going from 5 gigahertz to 5.16 off the top of my head. So that's a bigger gap than that's a bit of a bigger gap than with the and that's just a match. Okay, like so on the 8 core, like you better hope that your bad core is a lot worse than your other cores, because otherwise the per core hyperthreading doesn't really do anything for you. But man, if on a like actually just for fun, let's do this with like a 20 core CPU, right? So you have a 20 core 40 thread CPU. So we have 20 times 1.33, right? And then you can go 19 times 1.33 plus 1, right? Like, can you see why this is like on something like a 20 core CPU, this would be absolutely ridiculous? Like, because the thing is, like, you can easily pick up 100 megahertz by killing hyperthreading. Like, that is no problem. In fact, a lot of the time, if you disable hyperthreading on, like, currently, if you disable hyperthreading on an entire CPU, you can pick up even 200 megahertz in some cases. So, or even more than that. Like, hyperthreading is pretty bad for your overall frequency. So, if you can just drop a hyperthreading on one core and pick up 100 megahertz, especially if you have a lot of cores in total, man, that'll be cool. That's gonna be cool. So, yeah. So this is equivalent like 26.6, which is no surprise, and then the 19 times 1.33 plus 1. Yeah. See, this down here is equal to 26.27. Like, let me just quickly do the math on that. Divided by 26.27 Yeah, so there you would literally, so this gap right here, to bridge this gap with frequency, you would only need about 1.2%. Okay, no, 1.3%, let's round up. 1.3% more frequency to get a so a 2039, like, so basically what that means is like a 5.07, right? Let's say you did 5.07 on a 20 core, 39 thread CPU. That's faster than a 5 core, like 5.0, 20C 40 thread CPU. So I am like, this is a really cool feature. Like I'm super hyped for it. Like it's not that cool because Intel hasn't yet reached like AMD level core counts on their mainstream platform, so that we don't like we're not getting a CPU that like if you had this on a 16, like even on a 16 core, right? It would be a similar effect as on the 20 core where it's just like there's so many threads that getting rid of one of them just doesn't make that much of a difference to the overall performance, but if you pick up 100 megahertz by killing one thread, like your performance is just going up. And that is really like I'm excited. like that is really really exciting, for me at least, because it's just like now you finally have sort of because the thing is there's a lot of multi-core benchmarks where it's just like either your CPU is good or it's bad. And there's no in between because if you have one bad core on your entire chip, it's like, well, now it's useless for Cinebench because it's like if that one core is going to drag all the other cores down with it. But now if you have a 10 core and there's one bad core on it, you can just like disable hyperthreading on the bad core and hopefully it'll make up enough of the frequency gap that your actual and hopefully it'll push your overall frequency so much higher by doing that you'll actually still, your CPU will pick up a little bit of performance. Obviously, it's not going to be fast as a 10 core, 20 thread CPU at the same exact frequency, but if your cores, like if you have one terrible core, it is much less of an issue than it used to be. So I'm really excited for this. This is cool. This is cool. And then of course, if you have like a mega multi-threaded monstrosity, then it's just like you could probably actually get away. Like if you had two bad cores, you could probably get away with killing both. Right, because it would just because that would just be like 18 plus 2, and that ratio would, well, let's just try it, just for fun. Like you can ultimately do this yourself, but wait, really? That's just 24, 18. Oh wait, it was plus 2, not plus 1. Idiot me. So that would actually, so 18 times 1.33 plus 2, that would be 25.94, and in that case, the gap like the gap gets bigger. But if like you pick up, like let's say you have two cores which are like 200 megahertz behind the rest, right? Which if you have a 20 core, that's actually not completely unrealistic. Like the spread in frequency across a really high core count CPU can be quite large. So yeah, on something like again, like on a man, if they did this on like the 10980 XE, that would be just the coolest thing ever. um, so yeah, you would literally just need if you picked up at this point, the gap is just plus 2.5%, right? So again, if you just go which times 5 gigahertz, so if you went from 5 gigahertz to 5.13, you would make up for the loss of the hyperthreads, and you'd gain single threaded, and multi-core wouldn't change. Like, this is cool. Like, this is like, I love how Intel has been like for a while now. They've been going out of their way to just add silly little overclocking features like this, like the BCLK not being tied to anything, so you can actually run whatever BCLK you want, pretty much. Like this right now. Like this is cool. I love it. It's great. At least in the theory, it should be really cool. Um, so yeah, and so I'm excited. Like I'm excited to play with hyperthreading per core. Like that's a really really neat little toy to play with. So yeah, anyway, that's it for this video. I don't know. This might have probably it is really random, and we are looking at tiny little performance differences, but it's just like if you're doing benchmarks, this matters. Um, so like if you're competitively benchmarking, like being able to run, especially Cinebench, because Cinebench is super linear in terms of performance scaling. Like if you can pick up the small, like a little bit more free, like just enough frequency to overcome the hyperthreading loss, and then a little bit more above that, like totally worth it for Cinebench, right? And then I kind of wish the hardware bot had like a combined benchmark, which was both single. Well, actually, something like 3D Mark, if you throw enough GPUs at it, gets very single threaded. So that might that might also actually see benefit. Like your GPU score will go up because you're over like your single threaded performance has gone up, and then your physics score will not change, so your overall score goes up. Or if your physics score also goes up because your frequency improvement was actually bigger than the hyperthreading disable loss, then yeah, overall score goes up more, which is just like that's cool. So anyway, yeah, that's it for the video. So thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon where you can support me directly. That there's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can go buy shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. And that also helps out immensely with running the channel. There's a link to that down in the description below as well. And yeah, that's it for the video. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.